In this video, we're going to discuss subtractive saturation. What is it? How does it work? Why is it considered filmic? And what's the easiest way to apply it to your images? To understand subtractive saturation, we need to understand film. As this side of the new millennium, most people's journey into cinematography begins with digital, it's a common misconception that film mirrors the way that a digital camera works. Let's clear that up. There's two ways of producing color: additive color and subtractive color. First, let's talk about additive color. Imagine you have three lights pointing at a white wall. One light produces red light, the other produces blue, the final one green. These three primary colors mirror the way our own human vision works. When all the lights are turned off, I get black. If I want to produce white, I turn all the lights on. If I want the wall to be blue, I only turn on the blue light. If I want yellow, I'll turn red and green on. By adding additional light to the scene, it's possible to mix different colors. That's why it's called additive color. It's how a digital camera works with its Bayer pattern sensor. Each time the camera records a new frame, the photo sites start black and gradually collect more light. The final image is an additive mix of red, green, and blue light that the photo sites have collected. It's also how a projector or monitor works. By varying the voltage delivered to tiny subpixels, differing amounts of red, green, and blue light are mixed to create the desired color. Subtractive color works the opposite way. Instead of adding more lights to produce color, we'll start with a clean white light and then subtract unwanted wavelengths until we're left with the color that we want. We can do that by placing filters in front of that light source, like a colored gel, or by putting pigments, paint, on the wall that absorbs select wavelengths of light while reflecting others. By far the most common primary colors used with the subtractive color system is cyan, magenta, and yellow. Why? Because these colors are the exact opposites of red, green, and blue. It should be noted that a perfect yellow paint would absorb every frequency of light except perfect yellow. In reality, though, it's more accurate to say that the pigment's most reflected color is yellow and its least reflected color will be blue, the opposite of yellow. The same would be true of a yellow filter. That's why it appears yellow, but still contains other wavelengths of light. I can make the wall appear blue with an even mix of magenta and cyan paint. Both pigments allow blue light through, but cyan is good at absorbing red and magenta is good at absorbing green. If I want the wall to be black, then an even mix of every color will absorb most of the spectrum. That's the theory. Real life is a little bit more complicated though. A really good example of subtractive color at work is anything that's printed, like a newspaper, for example. You read your newspaper in clean white light, and on the paper, carefully arranged cyan, magenta, and yellow dots selectively subtract colors as the light bounces off the paper and travels to your eye. Film is also a good example of subtractive color at work. Film has cyan, magenta, and yellow dye layers. Now, did you know that's CMY layers, not RGB? Now, whether scanning or projecting, when you shine a clean white light through your developed film, each layer subtracts frequencies or colors from the clean white light to produce the colors that you ultimately see. Why does this matter? Because additive color manipulates colors by adding more light. It makes colors brighter. Subtractive color takes light away, making colors darker. Let me show you what I mean. Let's say you've shot a beautiful blue sky on film. The developed image will have an incredibly strong magenta and cyan record. When talking about film, we call this density. The more intense the blue sky was, the denser that part of the negative will become. And the denser the negative, the less light it will allow through when scanning or projecting. Additionally, as film approaches overexposure, it starts to become less sensitive to light. That sounds like a bad thing, but it's what actually gives film its incredible dynamic range and attractive highlight and saturation roll-off. Let's briefly compare that to the way a digital sensor saturates. In additive color, the stronger the blue sky becomes, the brighter that portion of the image becomes. If enough blue light falls on that part of the sensor, it can completely saturate and overwhelm the blue photo sites, causing clipping, even if that's only on one channel. There's no roll-off like you get on film, just a cliff edge. As a result, many people still consider film-like saturation to be more aesthetically pleasing than the way that digital cameras render highly saturated colors. Filmic saturation is the gold standard. The native saturation controls in Davinci Resolve apply additive saturation. As a result, if you overwork this control, you can create an unpleasing image. So here's 3 ways to simulate subtractive saturation in Davinci Resolve. First, the fake way. A simple approach to replicating the effect of subtractive saturation is to make a given color darker. This can be done globally by reducing gamma, or a specific color can be targeted with a hue versus luminance adjustment, Or finally, highly saturated colors can be targeted with a saturation versus luma adjustment. As you can see, this looks particularly bad. Some of these methods worked better than others. All three methods share similar problems. Reducing gamma darkens the entire image, not just saturated colors. Hue versus saturation also globally desaturates all blue, regardless of whether it's saturated or not, and can also create artifacts where one color transitions to another. And finally, a naturalistic image is hard to achieve with sat versus luma, again because it desaturates unwanted parts of the image too. I'll save a version of this grade with my best effort so we can compare it to other techniques later. It's possible to create subtractive saturation in Resolve without any paid plugins, but it's complicated. This technique is based on a method outlined by Cullen Kelly in his Mixing Light article. There's a link in the description, but please note, we've made a few tweaks to the technique. Manipulating the image's saturation subtractively requires us to separate the image's saturation from its luminance. Color models like HSL and HSV are great for this because they have channels dedicated to saturation and brightness. In this instance, HSV is the model of choice, as when using HSL, the luminance value affects the saturation of the color. At its maximum values, HSL produces white. However, at HSV's maximum values, it produces a fully saturated color. Create a new node, right-click and set its color space to HSV. That means that this node and this node alone will now operate in a different color model than all the other nodes. Now, my primary controls, instead of manipulating the image's red, green, and blue channels, will manipulate its HSV values. Now, R manipulates hue, G manipulates saturation, and B manipulates value. I only want the value or brightness channel. Reducing the gain for the red and green channels gets rid of hue and saturation and leaves us with just value. I'll create a layer mixer and just tidy up my node tree. I want to feed an unaltered copy of my image into the first input. It's not strictly necessary, but I'll create a new node with no adjustments, just to keep things tidy, and feed it into the first input of the layer mixer, and then feed my V node into the second input. Let's just connect my node tree back up to the output. By setting the composite mode of the layer mixer to subtract, I'm effectively taking away all the brightness information from the image and leaving just color. This leaves me with a black screen. There is still information there, but because of that subtract operation, the pixels have negative values. That's why it shows as black, but of course that information is preserved as Resolve works in 32-bit float. Now I'm going to add the V value back to that black image. That's the very value I subtracted from it in the first place. I need to create a node to do this, partly because you can't feed a layer mixer into a layer mixer, but mostly because I'm going to use this node shortly for my subsat operation. Don't forget to change the composite mode of your second layer mixer to add. It's undone what the first layer mixer did. If your image looks like it's not changed, then you've done the right thing. What's the point of all that work to end up with the exact same image? We needed to set all that up so we could do this. When I manipulate the gain control on this node, it adds subtractive saturation to the image. We can confirm that by looking at the scopes. When I add saturation by increasing the gain, the scopes show my red, green, and blue traces are decreasing in brightness. For reference, let's compare that to additive saturation. I'll reset my gain operation and just use the vanilla saturation tool. You can see that when I add saturation with this tool, the traces in my scope rise. I much prefer the subsat look. It feels deeper and more pleasing to look at. I'll reset and once again dial in some subtractive saturation with the gain tool. As blue is the most dominant color in this image, I'll focus on what this tool does to the blue channel. You'll notice it adds saturation by decreasing the red and green channels. The blue channel is almost static, it doesn't move. It looks very pleasing, and unlike our previous attempts, darkness and color casts are not added to unwanted parts of the image. The subsat operation is confined to the parts of the image that were already strongly saturated. It's simulating the way that film saturates. The stronger and brighter a color, the denser and thus darker that part of the negative becomes. A qualifier can also be used to limit saturation operations to a particular color range in the image. For example, I enjoy the effect of the subtractive saturation on the sky, but not on the model's skin or strongly colored jacket. It's difficult to create qualifiers on the subsat node, as thanks to our mathematical shenanigans, it's got negative values. That's why nothing shows in the viewer or on the scopes. Instead, I'll create a branched node and use this to build the qualifier. Let's do some housekeeping and name the node Qualifier. Then connect it to my node tree. I'm sourcing a clean copy of the image. Qualifiers are easier to build with the highlight mode turned on, so I can see what I'm doing. I will eyedrop the sky and tweak the hue qualifier. It's looking good. Let's pipe that key we just created by connecting the alpha output of my qualifier node to the alpha input of my subsat node. Now that subsat operation is limited to the blue sky in the image. That looks much better. I'm no longer getting that oversaturation on the skin and red coat. Once again, a big thanks to Cullen Kelly for detailing this method in his Mixing Light article. Again, I'll save this grade as a version so I can compare it later, but wow, that was complicated. It's doable, but complicated. These nodes can be compounded, but then it's no longer possible to manipulate the saturation effect, which will be buried inside. And setting this up on each shot that you have to work on, even if you use power grades, is going to be a pain. So, are you ready for option 3? DCTLs provide a framework for developers to augment Davinci Resolve's functionality. Several developers have made plugins for subtractive saturation, and we're looking at one, HueShift by Pixel Tools. Instead of building out complex node trees or using inferior methods, I can now apply subtractive saturation with a single node. Installation is super easy. Once purchased, just place the DCTL in the correct folder within your Resolve installation. Inside the color page, apply the DCTL effect to a node, and then select HueShift from the dropdown. The tool offers independent hue, saturation, and density controls for red, green, blue, cyan, magenta, yellow, and a final special control for skin tone. There's some additional controls here too that we'll explore shortly. Let's add some subsat to the blues in my image. I can confirm that this is subtractive saturation by looking at my scopes. You can see that as I add saturation to the blues, my blue parade is not increasing. In fact, it's not moving at all. Instead, my red and green traces are lowering. This tool has been developed by two names that you might know, Jason Bodak and Kaur Hendrickson. I'm loving using this tool. Instead of me doing a bad job of explaining how it works, how about we ask them and get some of their insights?
I'm Jason Bodak, and I'm the founder of Pixel Tools and the co-developer of the HueShift DCTL.
Can you tell us why did you make HueShift? What problem is it solving?
My purpose of creating HueShift was an easy utility that you can adjust the hue, the saturation, and the density of any hue, and it goes really smoothly. I'm a big fan of sticking in the creative mindset, and I have problems when you have to go, okay, there's a technical problem. I have to shift mindsets over to my technical mindset and then back to my creative. And I wanted it to be really easy for colorists to just, I want to shift my reds over here. I want a more true red, or I want a more purplish red. I'm a big fan of shifting greens over to teal, as a lot of people are. And I wanted it to be really easy to just, here's my green water. I'm going to shift it a tiny touch towards teal, and I'm going to make it a little bit darker and then move along without having to shift your mindset over to a technical mindset.
Can you give us an explanation of what density is and why that's so important to your work as a colorist?
Density is a really popular thing now. It's a very important part of film emulation, and it's essentially the luminance of a hue. Now, it's not just the luminance, but it gives that deep feeling, that deep tone. A lot of people, when they're creating film emulations, they'll add grain, they'll add halation, they'll add the contrast curve of a specific film emulation, and they'll look at it and they'll go, why does it not feel like the films that I've seen shot on Kodak Vision 3, Kodak, whatever film stock you're doing? And usually what they're missing is the density of those hues. Essentially, the colors shift non-linearly throughout the entire dynamic range. And that's why film is so unique. And I wanted to make a tool that added a little bit more nuance to that.
Is density something that's only relevant for a colorist that's grading a film emulation?
It's important to remember that we've been looking at film captures for over 100 years. So it's something that we're used to seeing. So even if you're not trying to emulate an exact film stock, it's important to remember that we have been seeing stuff captured on film for an excessively long time. We feel it deep down inside. So it's important to remember that density is a tool that we can use to lean towards a natural look that we are more comfortable, that we are more familiar with.
One of the things that I like about adding density, adding subtractive saturation to an image is on the spectrum of emulating film. I'm going to put dirt, scratches, sparkles, I'm going to put a little bit of gate weave on there. I'm going to maybe emulate a print stock. That's quite in your face, but I feel like subtractive saturation is a very important element of the film look. But by just selectively adding that and that alone to an image, it puts it in this really nice middle ground where it's like there's something rich and deep about this image.
I call that modern film emulation, in the fact that we are taking the best aspects of film, which is adding what we want from it, which is the density, which is the hue, which is the contrast curve, and not using the aspects that we don't want, which might be the noticeable grain, which might be the gate weave, which might be the dirt and scratches.
So this is really cool. Jason explained his grading mindset that influenced the development of this tool.
For me, color grading is best used as an art that is unnoticeable. We don't really want our audience to notice that it's been manipulated in a way. The best thing you can tell me is to notice that, that was a beautiful looking film. I really felt the narrative. I was really sucked into it. But where was your work? And to me, that means that I've done my job perfectly. I specifically started my development on HueShift because I felt limited, and I felt I was spending too much time in the hue V curves and the color worker, and I wanted a simpler, easier method to adjust the hue, saturation, and density. So if you are having similar feelings, I would recommend checking out the demo of HueShift and seeing if it improves your workflow.
I feel like it boils down the difference between 8 nodes or 1 node.
Exactly. And I was one of those guys who had these massive power grades and compounds nodes to do things like density. But then, especially as you get down to, I want to have density for teal, I want to have density for blue and red, and being able to quickly manipulate those, especially on hundreds, 1,500 shots, 18, 2,000, 3,000 shots, it gets to be very overwhelming. And then when you go back to that consistency, I want it to be the same way on every single shot. So I wanted to make almost what looked like a tool that was built natively for Resolve that enabled fast adjustment. And I wanted it to work on a panel. It needs to be efficient, it needs to be fast, and it needs to flow quickly.
We got to speak to Kaur too. So Jason's the visionary, and Kaur, he's equally as visionary, but in this instance, he's the developer that programmed this DCTL.
I'm Kaur Interview, and I'm the guy who made the tool. Jason reached out, having seen my different DCTLs that I've made, and found that, well, having so many different DCTLs in a node tree is kind of cumbersome, and he'd like to combine many of them into a single tool. And that's how HueShift was born.
Let's get Kaur's explanation of density and subtractive saturation too.
So in contrast to usual saturation, which tends to add to the RGB channels, subtractive saturation works where we're trying to achieve more colorfulness, if you may, by taking away from the RGB channels.
So what is the advantage of doing it with the DCTL rather than just brute forcing it yourself?
The main advantage of using this DCTL over just doing it manually is just the ease of use, where instead of building these whole huge node trees and then finding the right node to change the saturation and then, it's a whole mess, you just have a single slider that works.
There are a bunch of other controls in this DCTL. Kaur kindly explained what they do.
The deep slider is actually just a simple dequalification of highlights, where if you're applying saturation and you find that it's targeting colors in the lighter parts of your image that you don't like and don't want to change, then you can just apply the deep slider and it'll leave them put. So the sub/add slider, or subtractive additive slider, allows you to fade between the subtractive saturation model or mode and the additive mode to see which one looks better for your image. The density slider is actually modifying luminance based on saturation. So it isn't trying to add any more saturation, but it's trying to make very saturated colors darker, making them kind of deeper in that sense. And with the built-in qualifiers, we have made it where if you add all of the qualifiers together, you get the whole image. So you have control of every single pixel, but in a very smooth way, where it's quite difficult to break the image. This DCTL also includes hue shifting. And the interesting thing about it is that instead of using HSL or HSV that, well, most tools use, or if you're doing it manually, you would use, we are using the Gen spherical model.
Please definitely go check out Jason Bodak's websites and Kaur's awesome YouTube channel. Links are in the description. I hope you found this video helpful. If you'd like to try out or perhaps buy HueShift yourself, there's a link in the description. It is an affiliate link, so if you make a purchase, we'll get a small commission. It's not much, but it helps support the free content that we create at Team 2 Films. A big thanks to Jason and Kaur for their work on this tool and the time that we spent chatting. We've got some other thanks too. Cullen Kelly for his Mixing Light article detailing the manual process for subtractive saturation. Daria Fasoon for all the groundwork that she's done. Any journey in the color page always starts with the things that I've learned from her. And Darren Moston also has a great video out on subtractive saturation. It's informative and well worth watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe so you don't miss out on future videos. Thanks for watching.